Hello again and welcome back to our course on Excel 2019 Advanced. In this section, we're going to start to look at pivot tables. Now, many of you might have used pivot tables before, but I'm sure there's many of you out there who haven't. And for the benefit of those of you who haven't, I'm going to spend this first section explaining the basics, including explaining the situation in which you would use pivot tables. Now, if you haven't used them before and you really want to look at some of the more advanced features, in particular some of the new features, the updated features in Excel 2019, then you might well skip this first section. Having said that, I do find a lot of people who use pivot tables aren't necessarily all that comfortable with them. And I'm going to try and explain in some detail the situation in which you would use them, why you would use them, and really what pivot tables are all about. So even if you have used them before, you might well benefit from working your way through this section anyway. Now, you may or may not be aware that pivot tables really are one of the great strengths of Excel. They've been a part of Excel for many years and they continue to be improved in Excel. And even in this latest version in 2019, there are further enhancements and improvements to existing facilities. Now, first of all, what sort of data do we use in pivot tables? Well, pivot tables are suitable for use with what we call transactional data. And transactional data isn't necessarily to do with financial transactions, but it's any kind of data where each record corresponds to a measurement of something or a count of something. It could be a record of a sale in a store, or it could be a measurement for the amount of rain we've had on a particular day, for example. Now, these individual records need to be recorded in rows in a worksheet. If you actually have records recorded in columns, you would need to transpose them, and each row must correspond to one record. You mustn't have any empty rows, and you also mustn't have any missing or empty columns. The particular data we're going to use for the first example is data on sales in a cafe within a convenience store, and we're keeping 4 pieces of information on each sale. So the date on which the sale was made, the branch of the convenience store, the value of the sale, and the department. Now, there are quite a few different departments. You can see some there for the sale of breads, and if we scroll down, we have lots of different other departments. So things like grab and go, we have general, and if I scroll down even further, we have juices, so on and so forth. Now, there is actually quite a lot of data on this particular worksheet, over 30,000 records. Control down will jump me to the end, and you can see there we have 34,109 records. So essentially over 30,000 transactions, and this is the kind of situation where you might use a pivot table. Let's suppose you have a lot of data and you want to report on that data, and somebody says to you, well, can you actually do a presentation on this data? And you might say, well, okay, but what am I trying to show? Am I trying to compare these branches with each other? Or am I showing which department is best? Or am I trying to show if sales are increasing or decreasing over time? So working out what you're trying to show is very important before you start to construct your pivot table. Now, one of the great things about using pivot tables is that using a pivot table, you can pretty much answer all of these types of questions because you can do any comparison between any of the entities. And you can also do things like show trends over time. So pivot tables give us a great way of reporting on transactional data. Now, before we get started, there are a few things I want to point out. You do need to have column headings, and those must be different. As you'll see, they're very important when it comes to using pivot tables. I've already mentioned previously not having any blank rows and columns. Also, if in any numerical column you have a value of 0, it must be shown as a 0 and not just left as a blank or a space. And one other quick warning, if you've been using pivot tables for a long time, if you have any old pivot tables, say one from Excel 2003, that's not going to work in Excel 2019. So you'll have to recreate the pivot table. So let's get started on a pivot table. The data here is actually in a table already, and if I click inside it, you will see that I have access to the Table Tools contextual ribbon at the top with a sub-ribbon, shall we say, a design sub-ribbon. I can use the keyboard shortcut of Control * to select the whole of my table. And having selected the whole table, you can see the Quick Analysis button just at the bottom there. And if I click it and click on the Tables tab, I'm offered two alternative pivot tables. One of them will show the branches, again, the sum of the value of sales for each branch, and the other one will show departments for the sum of the values of sales for each department. I'm going to start with branches, and let me just zoom in. And there you can see my first pivot table. I have the branches in column A, and I have the value of sales in each branch in column B. And in fact, what I have in column B is the sum of the value of sales in each branch. Now, if you look over on the right, and I'm just going to expand this ever so slightly, you'll see we have a very important panel, which at the moment we will think of as being in two sections. The top section is the pivot table fields. In the top section, we have the pivot table fields, which show which of the fields in my data are currently shown. So you notice here that the branch and the value is shown. Branch is shown by name, and value is actually shown by the sum of the value, or the total value. Date is not shown, and also department is not shown. The bottom half of the panel is made up of what we call the drop zones, and there are 4 drop zones. There's a filter drop zone where we can filter the data we are seeing, and then we can set the data out in rows or columns. At the moment, we have our branches. They're represented by rows, so in each row we have a branch. We don't have any classification by column at the moment, but we will in just a minute. The values that are shown are the sum of values, and that represents the sum of the value column values for each branch. Now, the reason this is called a pivot table is that when a simpler version of this came in a long time ago, one of the main advantages was seen to be the fact that you can pivot the X and Y axis. So you can swap something that is in rows and put it up to columns. So I could grab branch and drag it up to columns. And you can see how that changes the data because I still have the same information. The difference is that each branch is a column and the sum of the values is shown against each of the branches. If I had more things plotted horizontally or vertically, or things plotted in both directions, then I can easily pivot them. Let me just for a moment put branches back to rows. So to round off this section, let me just demonstrate the pivot element and the power of analysis using pivot tables. I'm now going to enable the department in the pivot table fields part of the panel on the right. And when I do that, you'll be able to see a breakdown of sales by department. So I'm going to click Department. Note now that in the rows drop zone, I now have branch and department showing in there. But suppose I grab department and move it up to become a column. Let's see what happens. So I'm going to grab department, drag it to columns and drop. Now my analysis gives me a row for each branch and a column for each department. Not only that, but let's suppose I'm not really interested in all of those departments. Let me click on column labels and you'll see I have filtering capabilities. Let me switch off all of them. And we're going to say that we're just interested in coffee, hot teas, and juices, and click OK. Now my pivot table is filtered to show just 3 departments, and here I've got all 4 branches. But if I wanted to, I could filter on branches and only show it for, say, Atlanta and Houston. So as you can see, this gives you a very powerful reporting facility, and we haven't even started looking at dates yet. That's it for this section. We're going to go into more detail in the next one, so I will see you there.